5, perceiving objects and scenes. For each of these, I'm going to encourage you to pause, think, answer. I'll have a moment of silence, and then I'll tell you what I usually tell students. So most students say flowers for this, and I say these are hostas. I have rarely seen purple hostas, and you can see the water dripping from them. This is a beautiful picture taken by a friend of mine, Russell Jeffcoat. He is a professional photographer. The rest of these will be taken by me. I am not a professional photographer, and you will notice that. What is this? A sunflower with a bee on it. Maybe a more easily identified kind of flower than the hostas. I usually get the someone yelling out butterfly. I will tell you, it is a tiger swallowtail butterfly, and it is on a lantana flower. So I have lantana in my garden because it attracts butterflies. I often get a mixture of moth and butterfly. It is out in the daytime, so it is a butterfly. It is not one of the more colorful butterflies, but this is a buckeye butterfly. I actually sent this picture in to a group of people who are interested in bugs. So they told me what it was. I didn't know. And it also is on the lantana plant. I was trying to make it a teeny bit harder. This is my brother's artwork, and he is a bit abstract, but I usually get the answers of woods, forest, trees, that kind of thing. What is this? Another one of his pieces of artwork, and I usually get some mixture of people in the woods, people having a party. The woods are sometimes mentioned. That blue in the background is sometimes interpreted to be a river, again, because he's an abstract artist. He's actually under the label of neo-expressionist artist. It's left up a little bit more to interpretation. What is this? I did steal this as I was trying to find some different, one of those different ambiguous pictures where you can go back and forth between, this time it's the penguin and the man with the Elvis hair. What have we been doing? I am leaving these silences on purpose. I know. We've been recognizing objects, right? We've been perceiving objects and scenes and trying to interpret those objects and scenes. What makes it easy? Usually get people thinking a little bit, and there's a little bit of silence, and then people say usually things like that we've had experience with these things, so that background knowledge, right? That people who know butterflies can recognize the specific butterflies better. But if I don't have that background knowledge, I'm just saying butterfly because that's what I recognize. What makes it hard? I've had these 3 questions on here since I first started asking these questions, and when I used to start, I started with the pictures, and I didn't have anything else, and people would just sit there silently, which is part of the point in a way. But then I added my brother's ambiguous pictures, and so people would say, well, it's more ambiguous, there's some interpretation, it was kind of abstract. And then I added the ambiguous picture, which also might make it a little trickier. Some people would say things like, I didn't recognize the type of butterfly or the kind of flower, and that kind of thing, because I didn't have the background knowledge. But what makes it hard? Not much, right? This was easy. This is seamlessly simple thing. It's a seamlessly simple thing to do, but when we talk about the challenges for object recognition and why this should be very hard and why it took so long for us to really create perceiving machines that do a good job of recognizing objects, you'll think, wow, it is. It's incredibly easy. When we look at something, we just recognize it right away. That's almost our first conscious experience. We don't consciously really think through, hey, here are these features of, vertical lines and horizontal lines. We just recognize objects. So everything up to now has been kind of really behind the scenes and talking about the brain activity or the sensory neurons. But now we're going to talk about how are we doing this conscious piece of recognizing objects. Some of the challenges of object recognition. One is object constancy, that we can perceive an object and we can see it as being unchanged, even though we see it in these different kinds of conditions where what's happening at the level of the retina, right, of what's hitting my retina, that proximal stimulus, is wildly different. If we're looking at this picture of the rubber ducky, I'm looking at it head on versus from the side versus maybe from an angle with a little bit of shadow. We have different viewpoints, we have different lightings, we can see things that are blurry and occluded, and we still do, again, a really good job, a seamless job of being able to recognize these objects, even though, and we kind of, when we see them as being constant, even though they're not, we don't actually have object constancy when we talk about the information that's hitting the retina. If we look at the example up at the top, if I asked you which face looks more like the first one on the left, the one in the middle, or the one on the right, most human beings easily say it's the one on the right, that face is the same face but in profile, right, like from a different viewpoint, and we don't have a problem with that. Perceiving machines, while they've gotten better since he's taken this picture out of the book because perceiving machines have gotten so good, but we still really, it's easier for them if we're looking at them from the same perspective. And A and B, or the first one, the left one and the middle one, look more similar than the left one and the far right one. We can also see blurry objects really well, and I've kept this in from a previous edition, and also in the next slide I show you what's in the newest edition to kind of show you what's interesting is how much our background knowledge and experience influence whether or not we can recognize these blurry objects. So I'm going to go from left to right and tell you who these people are. I'm going to pause so you do it for yourself and mentally just kind of quickly go through who do I recognize this person. So from left to right, that's Prince Charles, Woody Allen, Bill Clinton, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Richard Nixon, and Princess Diana. When I started teaching this in 2012, these were people who were in the news quite a bit. If we look at the new pictures, I'm not even going to tell you who they are, and you're going to say, oh, this is so easy. Right, if I switch these out now, I will tell you, in case you don't have your book and you can't go look this up, because one of them is a little bit frustrating. These are the people who we know better now. We see them in the news, right? They're more part of our background knowledge of people your age. So if we go from left to right, Will Smith, Taylor Swift, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Jackie Chan, Ben Affleck. He's the one who's usually called something else. It's obviously not as clearly. He's a little ambiguous with some other actors. And then Oprah Winfrey. And again, now those ones are really quite easy for you, as those are the people that you've seen many, many, many times. And even though they're blurry here, you can still recognize them. The second challenge for object recognition, along with this object constancy, is the ambiguity of the image on the retina. So we have this inverse projection problem that an image on the retina can basically be caused by a virtually infinite number of objects, right? So if I'm looking at this piece of paper, that's actually what I'm seeing, and it's a certain distance away. That's going to hit my retina as a certain sized rectangle, but that could be a trapezoid from a different angle. It could be a rectangle that's larger and larger as it gets farther and farther away. As it's farther and farther away, if it's taking up the same amount of retinal space, it's going to have to be larger and larger. It could be a different shape from a different kind of angular perspective. So infinite number of objects, because we have these two-dimensional retinas, we have this inverse projection problem. And that image is extremely ambiguous. On the retina is one of the reasons it has been such a challenge to make a perceiving machine. Why this took us decades and decades after, in the 1950s, they created those huge computers. They thought, hey, we're going to have robots, but the perceiving machine, we have finally gotten to where it's really quite good. So he gives us some statistics back in 2012. This is when I actually first taught this class. That perceiving machine was at 16%, and so we were making a pretty big deal about it. Looked like we weren't very close. I mean, we don't misinterpret things 16% of the time, but by 2017, the perceiving machine makes about 2% mistakes. And I'll say, as a person who just I feel like 2% is on the level of humans. We still make mistakes sometimes, right, when we're trying to perceive objects. And I will say that my experience, so I have some experience with people who have had Alzheimer's, and this perceiving objects and really being able to recognize objects, it goes as part of Alzheimer's. And again, really depending on the amount of background experience, where older experience, when the experience from when they were younger, is more powerful. Another challenge for object recognition is it's not just that we can perceive these different objects from different viewing conditions and occluded and so forth, but this object learning is another challenge. We can learn a new object in one viewing condition and then be able to identify it in different viewing conditions. Another challenge for object recognition is categorization, that you can get new instances of a category, something that you've never seen before, and you're really good at categorizing it. This isn't true 100% of the time. Many times, unless we've been explicitly told more than once, maybe even by somebody, that a bat is a mammal, we would tend to see a bat as a bird because it shares so many properties with birds, and it's not a very prototypical mammal. But here I have gone out to find all different rare dog breeds. That's what I looked up, because you will see throughout this course that I'm a big lover of dogs and cats and home pets and all of that. But for all of these, you're not confused, right? What is that? And I know I'm sitting here saying they're dogs, but for each one of those, they're clearly a dog, even though most likely you have never experienced this specific example or instance of a dog before. You're able to categorize them as dogs. There are a number of theoretical approaches to object recognition. So people who are trying to answer this question of how the visual system does this job of recognizing objects given the challenges that we've just gone through. The first one is recognition by components theory. You can see that this was proposed in the 1980s by Irving Biederman. It is a very bottom-up kind of description of how we must be doing this recognition of objects. And I did not say this before, I don't think, but I am going to go through this little bit of brief. So back in the 50s, when Hubel and Wiesel discovered those feature detectors in the visual cortex, there was some excitement. We had just really started this field of cognitive psychology, and now here was this information about how the brain worked. And so the cognitive psychologists for a few decades went around and looked at different kinds of potential ways that we are putting those features together and how we would do that to recognize objects, whether we're using potentially templates or whether we actually have to do some construction from features. And so at that point, for again decades, those features were lines, and they would talk about basically letters. Like there are all different ways that you can see an A, and people write it differently. It can be capital, it can be in cursive, all of these different things. So how do we use a template? How do we put these features together? Well, in the 80s, Irving Biederman decided that this really should apply to just more than letters. It should be applying and describing how we recognize the objects of the world. And so he was using these features, but in this case, we're going to have three-dimensional shapes. So according to Biederman, all objects can be described by a finite set of three-dimensional shapes, which he ended up calling geons, that were basically pulling these things apart into geometric ions. If you think about the ions in chemistry being the smallest thing that then gets put together into bigger constituents, molecules, and so forth. So we have these geons. According to Biederman, he proposed that there were 36 geons that would help us, that would enable us basically to mentally represent maybe not all objects in the world, but a large portion of the easily recognizable objects of the world. We ended up getting all kinds of evidence that suggested that yes, we are using these geons. One of the early things that he discovered was that not all information is equal as far as how it helps us to recognize objects. And what he found was that if you obscure specifically those meeting points, which would tell us about the geons themselves, right, then losing that information is more costly than losing other information. And so it's difficult to tell from these examples because we're getting the answer, but from what he found, if you look at A, those are my objects in that left-hand image. If you look at B, the intersecting points are maintained. And if you look at C, those intersections are taken out. If we look at, if we compare B to C, those two different conditions, the exact same percentage of information was taken out of the picture. Just one was giving me the intersecting or the meeting points, and people, so in B, where we have those meeting points, people did better. Participants more often and more accurately recognized the objects from A, and if people were given the pictures from C, they were worse at recognizing the objects, that it was the object in A. And these were nicely counterbalanced, and people were in every participant was in every condition. So I would either see B or C for every object. And yeah, it was beautifully designed study, and he got good evidence for this recognition by components theory. Piece of this that we can see, so I had that accidental viewpoints are also an issue that he did find were an issue. So if we look at the brick geon, those meeting points, and there are specific properties that are helpful for helping us recognize that brick geon, and he called these non-accidental properties, those properties that are helping us to really recognize the brick geon in this case, or naps. So non-accidental properties were called naps. So if I clearly get line 1, line 2, line 3, I can see that Y intersection, I can see that other intersection, I can see those intersections, I recognize the brick geon, and the brick geon is more helpful for recognizing whatever object it is a part of. If we spin that brick around so that all I see is the tip or the top of that brick, it's not as helpful, right? It's not giving me as much information. And we can see similar kinds of things for the cylinder geon. Recognition by components theory of this idea of, so that brick geon being helpful, and you can see the second thing over the suitcase, we can see clearly that brick geon. It's more helpful in recognizing that suitcase. And we can see on that bottom row 3, the cylinder, it's helpful in every case of helping us to recognize the cup, the pail, and the lamp. I do like this picture for several reasons, and one of the reasons is that phone seems to some extent like a little bit of a cheat. We've pulled the brick geon so that it's in a kind of a different shape, and same with the number 5 geon has more, it's slightly different, but then you can also see the 3 So when that cylinder is kind of shoved through, right, in my old rotary phone that we don't have anymore, which is also funny that this is it's old objects from the 80s, but yeah, so maybe 3 isn't as helpful for recognizing the phone in this example, just as an example. Evidence for recognition by components theory is the more geons he would give somebody, the more percentage of geons he would give for a particular object, the more likely, the better people were, the more accurately they identified those objects. So for a 9 geon object, if I get 3 of those geons, I'm down at 78%, but if I get 6, I'm up at 96%. And you can see this picture of an airplane and getting how we might be getting or giving people more and more geons, and how they might be more and more able to recognize those objects, which he also took as evidence for recognition by components theory. If I ask you now, what are some potential difficulties for recognition by components theory? I will suggest you pause this and think about it for a second. There are a number of potential difficulties, but I am going to just say here that for me, one of the things that pops out is that this is a completely bottom-up explanation of how we are perceiving the world, and so it leaves out that influence of the top-down information, right? Any kind of background knowledge of things, experience. If I have more experience with airplanes, I'm more likely to recognize an airplane. I'm more easily going to say the word airplane in response to this, and so like that. But there are other difficulties, and students usually do a really good job of. This is not a fully explanatory theory, clearly. I'm going to start with our second theory as an approach to object recognition, and then I'm going to stop us and restart this on the second bunch of the second video. But so Gestalt psychology came about historically in the early 1900s. At the time, it was really a response to the fact that if you know your history of psychology, when those first psychology labs opened up, we had basically functionalists who were interested in the functions or the adaptive value of human thought and behavior, the brains and everything, versus that structuralism. So functionalism versus structuralism was our first really big argument in psychology, where the structuralists were doing this research where they would basically show you something like a light flashing and seeing if you could see that this was a light flashing, right? And so they really came from that Fechner kind of background, and they were looking at these basic components of perception, suggesting that we could just put those sensations together into an overarching like explanation of how we're perceiving the world. But Max Wertheimer was the person who really started Gestalt psychology, which now has a couple of different branches of this more perceptual. So the more hardcore kind of cognitive science perceptual piece that came about in the 19 teens. But then I want to say it was in the 40s or 50s, might have even been early 60s. Probably need to look that up. But there were therapists who started using what they called Gestalt psychology, where what they were trying to say was we need to look at these human beings as more of a whole, and not this discrete, like here I am coming into you and telling you what's going on with me, but I am, I have this background, I have the system that I'm from, I have, I should be sort of accepted and understood as a whole person and not just these discrete, these little tales I'm saying, whatever I'm kind of working on, or what these little pieces and parts need to be put into a bigger whole. And Max Wertheimer, for the perception piece of this, so he bought a toy stroboscope, which we don't have anymore because we have movies. But so at the time, This was a way of entertaining yourself before we really had very many movies, and silent movies were just starting to become a thing, just starting. And so you could buy these things where basically you'd have an animation and then it would be in a slightly different position and a slightly different position, and you would have a little eye hole and you could spin that animation and it would look like the little person is moving, right? Because we made those slightly different positions just right so that it looked like this apparent motion. This is an illusion of movement. This is how movies and everything work, right? We're seeing these discrete pictures. We're putting them together into this whole perception of some scene or whatever. We can see this with the phi phenomenon, which I'm showing on the right there. If we have a light stimulus, we have darkness, and it's with the right timing, and then we have that light stimulus in a new place. What we end up seeing is the light comes on and it moves over to the second position. If I get that darkness, that timing wrong, they either look like they're kind of coming up at the same time almost, or they look like one comes up, pause, and a new one comes up. But if I have the right timing, I perceive this apparent motion, this illusion of movement. And so at the time with this toy stroboscope, Max Wertheimer's question was, how is this illusion of movement caused by discrete sensations? If we take those discrete sensations and we don't allow it to have this more overarching part of our perception of time and our sort of more complete picture, then it doesn't give us that illusory movement. We get that because we're not just putting together discrete sensations. We are creatures in space and time, and we're putting together complex information in a not kind of really structuralist sort of way, but in a more Gestalt. And Gestalt is German for shape or whole.